you very much, Shane. I appreciate it. As Shane mentioned, my name is Andrew Wiley. If any of you know me, please, or if you contact me, feel free to call me Drew. That's what most of my friends do. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about test score validation, the processes, the procedures, and a little bit of the theory that's involved around test score validation. Before kind of diving into the work, I want to kind of throw out two quick caveats here. One is you may or may not be aware that Alpine is a 100% virtual organization, and so when we are not traveling, each of the Alpine employees works at home. I actually work and live in Brooklyn, which is a great place to live, but not necessarily a great place to lead a webinar. So if, as I'm going through the conversation, all of a sudden you hear some sirens or perhaps a car alarm, please, I'll try not to let that happen. It seems to be a pretty quiet day so far, and I got things locked up, but you may end up hearing a little bit of background noise, and if you do, I apologize in advance for that. The second thing I want to note is, and Shane gave me a heads up here, is that all of you are on mute right now. And so I'm going to be kind of going through a bit of a monologue here where I talk about test score validation and go through all of that. And I have to admit, that's not exactly my favorite way to go through this process. It's always a lot more interesting, a lot more fun to sit down and talk to individuals or talk to groups of folks about things like test score validation, because I think one of the things about it is there's really got to be kind of a push and pull. There's got to be a give and take about the given requirements of a given testing program, the restrictions that they have, the data that they have, and finding ways to fit your validation argument into those practical restrictions. And so I think that's where conversations about test score validation can be particularly compelling and particularly interesting, which unfortunately we're not really able to do today. So you're going to end up hearing me just kind of talk for quite a while about this. But I think in the end, when you're thinking about your program and you're thinking about what you need to do, you really need to kind of go through that give and take and start thinking about all those different issues there. So I'm going to go through this and talk about test score validity. Now, certainly when we start talking about validity, this is really at the heart of the value and the use of any testing program. When you look at the standards that exist that are released by AERA, American Educational Research Association, National Council on Measurement Education, American Psychological Association, those organizations release the standards and focus and spend an awful lot of time talking specifically about validity. And when we talk about validity, what we're saying is, what extent is the evidence and theory supporting the interpretations to what extent do the evidence and theory support the interpretations of test scores for the proposed uses of your tests? And as the standards say, this is really the fundamental consideration that you have to think about when you're talking about validity. And when you're thinking about the value and how much you can get from your testing program, validity really is at the heart of the matter. And so I think us spending a little bit of time on it and us kind of going through that process is time well spent and absolutely essential for all of you to think about as you're going through your testing program. Now, when we start talking about validity, one of the things we have to talk about, and people have a tendency to think about the validity of a test. But what I think you want to try to make sure that you're doing is thinking about the validity of a given use of a test score or a given intended use of a test score. And the reason why this is important is because when you start thinking about the validity of a test, the task that's in front of you is so amorphous or so big that it can become daunting. But on the other hand, when you start thinking about the validity argument that you need to build for a specific intended use, you can see where you start actually having more focus into the conversation and more focus into what it is that you want to do and what information you need to be able to provide. So before we get into kind of how you can start collecting data and start collecting some information for validity, I want to talk a little bit about just kind of the general theory about validity, what people are doing. I don't want to go into extensive detail here, and I freely admit that this is the psychometric geek side of me coming out a little bit here, where I want to talk a little bit about the psychometric theory and the validity theory, just to give you that background and to help you kind of work through those issues. Certainly when people like myself start talking about validity, the person who we point to more often than anybody else is Michael Cain. And so Michael Cain has really been one of the drivers of validity theory who has really kind of influenced the direction that we have. And he was one of the people who really focused on the idea of, let's not talk about validity of a test itself. Let's talk about validity of the intended use of a test score. And so the theory there that Michael Cain developed and really pushed towards is the idea of identifying a clear statement on the intended use of a set of test scores, and then building an argument around that. And so providing evidence from a variety of different sources that says, here's why our testing program is valid. Another critical point that Michael Cain made as he was going through this process is he really talked about how there is not a single piece of evidence that you should be thinking about when you're thinking about validity of a given intended test score usage. Instead, you should be building kind of multiple bricks in the wall, if you will, and you are kind of providing consistent support. And with each layer or with each brick, you're building a stronger and stronger wall that you're kind of supporting your validity of your testing program. And so when you're going through this and you're trying to identify what you can do and what you cannot do, I think there's a bad habit that some people have where they're trying to chase the perfect piece of data or the perfect piece of information. And that really doesn't exist. And I think one of the things that was valuable about what Michael Cain talked about is he acknowledged that there's not kind of that perfect piece of evidence and that there's not one piece of evidence that's going to answer every piece of your validation argument. But instead, acknowledging that you're going to have multiple pieces, and it could be 3 or 4 different things that you're going to need to focus on. And I'll kind of walk through some of those examples as we kind of move forward. All of these things together become your validity argument, as opposed to kind of one separate study done over here. And I think Cain kind of pushed us in that direction. So when people start talking about the sources of evidence, the 5 broad areas that are frequently cited, I have listed here. We talk about the content of the assessment, the internal structure, the relation with external variables, the response processes, and testing consequences. And so I'm going to talk about these pretty quickly, but then what I'm going to try to do is walk through kind of the assessment life cycle that Alpine kind of likes to talk about and go through, and talk about how consistently throughout the entire life cycle of your assessment, you can be collecting information and data to support all of these different sources of evidence. So when we start talking about content, really what we're looking for here, one of the other things I should have probably mentioned at the beginning is my background in general is in the education space. And so I realize that an awful lot of folks on the phone are from the credentialing, certification, and licensure type of environment. And I've done some work in that area, but when I call out examples and things like that, I probably will more often than not call out examples from the education space. But certainly the general principles of test score validation, while they are slightly different from an education to a credentialing type of environment, they're not that radically different. And in some ways, the process you need to be following is fairly consistent. And so while some of my examples might be a little heavy on the education side, we can certainly talk about this from a credentialing side just as easily. So when we start talking about content, basically what we're looking at here is we're saying, okay, let's look at the relationship between the content of the assessment and the given standard that you're after, now, or the construct that you're intended to measure. Now, in the education space, what we could be talking about here is something like the Common Core state standards that people talk about an awful lot. On the other hand, from a credentialing perspective, this could be what are the essential knowledge and skills that are needed to practice in a given profession or to perform a certain activity. And so for all of them, when we start talking about content, we need to provide evidence to support the fact that the content of our assessments are appropriately tapping into the constructs of interest. And again, I'll try to give you some practical examples of this as we move forward. A second area that people like to talk about is responsive process that people will talk about. And here, what we're really going after is for a person who is taking the test, are they responding to a given item, whether it be a performance task, whether it be a simple multiple choice item, whether it be a elaborate simulation type of task in front of them, are they responding to the given item or to the given task in the way that we believe? And so frequently when people are going through the initial development process of an assessment, they'll sometimes actually sit down with a small sample of people and actually ask them to kind of do a think aloud where they're talking about what's happening with their given assessment. And so that's what people are looking at when they're thinking about the response process. And so this is an area that in some areas you see more prominently in others, but it's always an interesting concept to actually sit down and find out how people are responding to the items that are on your assessment. Moving on to internal structure. When we start talking about internal structure, anytime you have an assessment, and if we use an example of a simple multiple choice test, where you've got a math test, and on that math test you say you have an algebra section, a geometry section, and a statistics section. Internal structure is providing information or providing evidence to support the structure of your assessment and saying that those test items that you think are tapping into algebra truly are algebra and are distinct from geometry and are distinct from statistics. And so you're providing information there to support the overall structure of your examination and the scoring of your examination. The next area that I want to mention is just the relationship with other variables. And I think this component of validity is probably the area that people think about an awful lot in the education space, where they talk about, okay, we've created an assessment and we're going to use it for college graduation or for high school graduation. You then look at the correlation between your given test score and the performance of the student in high school or their later performance in college. And so you're looking for that kind of consistency of your test score with other external measures. And I think that's what people have a tendency to focus on in the education space in particular when they're talking about validity and developing the validation argument there. The last one is consequential. And certainly with consequential, this one can be a little bit of a difficult one to kind of get your hand around, quite frankly. What we're talking about here when we're looking at consequential validity is we're talking about, okay, if you've gone through and you've developed an assessment and you've said that we can use this assessment to measure student growth as they go throughout high school, there's a consideration around how is that given testing program going to be implemented? How will it be used in the schools, and what will be the overall impact of using this test in this way? And so when we start thinking about consequential validity, we're kind of taking a little bit of a step outside of the test score. And we're saying, okay, we're going to use the test score in this way. So we've developed an intended use for the test score, but are there other components of this? Are there kind of downstream impacts that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the overall validity of our program? So that's kind of what you're getting into with a consequential validity argument. And as I said, it's definitely, I think, the most difficult component, and perhaps, I don't think just for me, certainly it's definitely the most difficult component to get around when I start thinking about building a validation argument. And I think that's fairly consistent with other folks, because when you look at most programs, they don't necessarily approach this all that extensively. And there's sometimes people are just kind of doing this a little bit quickly or a little bit kind of offhand, and some people, quite frankly, are not doing it at all. And so I think the consequential validity area is still an area that people are struggling with a little bit. So those are the five broad areas that people have a tendency to focus on, and it's, you know, certainly nice to sit down and think about this, but practically speaking, as a sponsor or the owner of a testing program or someone who's considering adopting a test for use, how exactly are you going to take this theory of validity and start applying it to your overall program? If any of you have worked with Alpine or have dealt with us in the past, you probably have seen this wheel that I just popped up onto the screen here. We like to use it, and we find it to be an incredibly useful way for us to think about the overall assessment life cycle. And what you'll see here, where we like to talk about how all of the different components of the assessment life cycle are really tied in to your validation argument. And so if you're going to go through a process and be able to demonstrate the validity of a given test score use, you need to be thinking about all of these different areas and kind of building it in to the process throughout. And that's really one of the key points that we're trying to make when we start popping up our wheel here, our validity wheel, as we like to say, is basically we're trying to encourage people to think about the validation argument that they're going to build or that they're going to need to build throughout the entire process from beginning to end. And certainly if you are a test sponsor or a test owner, you're going to be involved in all of these conversations, and you're going to be looking at this from the very beginning all the way through the entire life cycle of your program. If, on the other hand, you're someone who's coming in and saying, look, I need to adopt a program or I need an assessment that I can use for my given use, well, you may not be the person who's actually designing the test. You should be able to get information on what was happening, how the given test sponsor designed the test, how they created the blueprint, and things like this. So you should be able to actually collect information and gather information on all of these components as well to help you determine if this given test is appropriate for you or can be used within your given needs. So going back to this, one of the other things that when we start talking about different areas that we like to have people focus on are just these three key questions that frequently help us kind of guide what data needs to be collected, what information needs to be collected as you think about it. And so we just like to talk to people about who was involved in the process throughout all of these steps. What actually was the process involved, and what were the outcomes? And so you're going to end up seeing me pop up these three questions over and over again, because I think these help us focus on what we need to have and what information we need to have when we're building that validation argument. And one of the other reasons why we like to use these three questions and why I find them particularly useful is when we start trying to think about how are we going to organize our validation argument and how are we going to present it and how are we going to make it suitable for people to understand, because certainly all of us are going to have to go to a board of directors, we're going to have to go to the public at large, we're going to have to go to a lot of different groups, and we're going to have to be able to present why our testing program works. At the heart of it, when people start asking you those questions, they're asking, is your test valid? And when you start thinking about all of these different steps and you start being able to provide systematic information about the process that was followed as well as who was involved in that process, those are the key factors in building your validation argument. And so I think that's why we like to use these questions, and that's why you'll see me pop them up over and over again, because I think it not only does it help us focus on what needs to be done on each step, I think it also presents a useful way for us to think about how we can present the information to our users as well. Okay, so going back to our overall kind of assessment life cycle. I'm not going to actually walk through because this monologue is, an interesting exercise, but certainly the opportunity to kind of go through them in kind of a Q&A process might be more effective. But what I'm going to try to do is highlight kind of some of the key big chunks of what people are doing, talk about the type of information that needs to be collected and the type of data that could be involved. And so from a really broad perspective, at the beginning, we're talking about program design and test design. And so laying out the overall structure of your program, whether it be the decisions as far as how often your test will be given, the exact purpose of your assessment, who will be taking your test, all of these things are going to be critical questions that you're going to need to address at that program design stage. And from a validation perspective, or from a test score validation, this again goes back to the work that Michael Kane did, where the absolute essential step is taking the time to say what it is this test score is going to be intended to be used for. And without a clear statement about that, building a validation argument is going to be incredibly difficult, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to know what information you're going to need, what data you're going to need. If you just have a kind of vague, oh, we think our test is going to be, it's going to measure math. That's not going to be particularly useful, but if on the other hand you can start saying, we're going to use this test in mathematics to make a decision on whether or not a student should be tracked into a given math class. Now all of a sudden you have something a little bit more concrete, and you have something that you can now start working on as far as building a test score validation process. Certainly, one of the things, I keep mentioning building kind of a validation argument and developing a clear statement for the use of a given test. I don't want to imply that a test can absolutely have one and only one use, but on the other hand, I think as you start thinking about making, the more things you're asking a test score to do, the more complicated your validation argument is going to become. And so when you start thinking about the complexity of your claim or the number of claims that you're going to make, I think you need to make sure as you're thinking about this kind of your downstream impacts as far as what kind of validation steps you're going to need to follow. And so if, for example, you have a statement that just says the test score is going to be used to identify students who are prepared to succeed in college. That's a fairly simple statement. And I think you can start imagining how you could build a validation argument when you start thinking about, okay, it's who's going to succeed in college. Let's find out if those who do well on our test succeed in college and go from there. But if on the other hand, you start saying to people, our test score is going to identify those who are prepared to succeed in college, but then also provide information on domains or content areas that a student needs remedial assistance with. All of a sudden, what you've done is you've kind of seriously changed the validation argument that you need to build, or seriously expanded upon the validation argument that you need to build, because you now need to think about how are we going to verify that those students actually need remedial assistance. You can't just say, all right, we're going to provide this information, we're going to kind of walk away. If people challenge you on that and ask you whether or not that portion of the test is valid, you need to have some evidence to support that. The same thing can happen in the credential and licensure area. And again, this is probably going to be an example where my education background is going to be kind of highlighted, because this is probably not the perfect example, but you can have a statement here saying that a candidate who passes a given test has demonstrated the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to practice in a given profession. And so again, while this is certainly not going to be an easy validation argument, you've got a fairly clear statement here on what is necessary, what a student has, and kind of you can imagine building a validation argument from that. On the other hand, if you start kind of expanding upon that in just a little bit, where you start talking about not only do they have the knowledge and skills abilities, but now you start talking about public safety when working with the individual. And so one of the other components of this program design that you need to think about is this stakes or the value process that you're putting into your claims. And so this is an example where you've got in statement 1 a fairly clean statement about the test score used. And you just say it's necessary to practice in a given profession. With statement 2, you've kind of significantly upped the ante of it, and you've significantly increased the pressure on your program. And you've also significantly upped the amount of information and the amount of data that you're going to need to be able to provide. And so while it's in some ways very tempting to kind of build these very grandiose statements about what a test score can be used for, you need to also be kind of taking a step back and thinking about, okay, are we making realistic statements about our tests, and can we build a validation argument to support that? Is there going to be data, and is there going to be information necessary for us to do that? And so those are just kind of some quick things for you to think about when you're looking at the overall program design and test design process. But again, kind of jumping down in the process, thinking about what's going to happen when you're actually determining the domain or determining the blueprints of your test. And so here, what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, what are we going to assess? What are the appropriate knowledge, skills, and abilities for us to test? If we have a licensing program and we're certifying architects or we're certifying physicians, we're going to have to go through a process of saying, okay, what are the essential knowledge, skills, and abilities for a physician who's going to practice in this area? If they're going to be a pulmonologist, what exactly are they going to need to know to practice in that area? And going back to kind of the key questions that we ask about, where we talk about who was involved and what process was involved, what you're going to need to be able to demonstrate here when you're determining the domain, the knowledge, skills, and abilities, is that you've had a systematic and comprehensive process for determining what those domains are. And so you start saying to yourself, okay, who was involved in the process? If you want to have a strong validity argument, you've got to make sure that you're tapping into subject matter experts who are working in the field. So if you're going to be certifying architects or you're going to be certifying physicians, you're going to need to make sure that physicians who are in there, who are subject matter experts, are part of this process. If it's just 4 or 5 people kind of sitting in a room creating a blueprint on their own, and those 4 or 5 people do not have the knowledge and skills necessary to know what is essential in this given area, your validation argument is not going to be particularly strong. But on the other hand, if you can say, we did a survey of all practicing physicians in this given area, and we asked them what they do on a daily basis, what knowledge and skills do they have, what knowledge and skills do they need to have to be able to practice, those are going to be stronger validation arguments than you have when you're kind of doing it on your own. You also want to think about, when you think about who was involved in the process, you want to think about the diversity of the population who's going to be using your test. And so if you're certifying teachers, and you only have teachers from private high schools involved in the process, or you only have teachers from a given geographic region involved in the process, you're going to have a little bit of a flaw there in your validation argument where people are going to naturally question you and say, look, teaching is not universal. It's not exactly the same in Massachusetts and Texas and California. And so if you don't have the essential diversity of your student or your test use population involved, you're going to get criticized for that. And so thinking about who is involved in that. And also think about, when we talk about the diversity of your test users, it could be geographic as an essential component. It could be demographic information like gender or ethnicity is a critical information. It could be language status. There could be a lot of different components here that impact your diversity. And given your content area If you're certifying people in a certain area, geographical region may mean absolutely nothing, but on the other hand, years of experience may be an essential component. And so you've really got to sit down and say, okay, what are the essential areas that we think about when we think about our test users and what areas they're working with. And then we start thinking about the process. I obviously alluded to this already, but if your process does not involve a systematic collection of information and a systematic gathering of data from a wide variety of people, the process that you're following is going to become problematic, and you're not going to be able to necessarily support your test score use as well as you would like. But if, on the other hand, you've gone through and done a survey of current practices and you've had subject matter experts sit down and actually look at your survey results, process all of that, and kind of systematically create a test blueprint, you're going to have a lot more confidence in that test blueprint, and you're going to have a much stronger validity argument when you start thinking about why are certain areas covered more extensively than others. And you can point to a survey that says, well, when we surveyed practicing physicians, they said this given domain was absolutely essential, and they said another domain was not as critical. And when you have that data, when you have that information to back up the blueprints that you've created, your validation argument is so much stronger than kind of just opinion or kind of using all of that together. Excuse me. Okay, so that's what I wanted to kind of talk about when we start thinking about the process of analyzing the domain, creating the blueprint. But going back to our overall assessment lifecycle, I'd like to talk a little bit about these kind of three broad areas that I'm kind of loosely calling the development process. And so certainly you've gone through a process and you've said, okay, here's what we're going to test, here's what our content blueprints look like on the test, but now you actually need to create the bloody test, which obviously presents a whole set of challenges unto itself. But again, let's go back to our three questions and think about who is going to be involved in this process of creating the test, what were the procedures that were followed, and what kind of eventually came out of it. So when we start thinking about who was involved, we want to find out, were the people practicing in a given profession? If you're certifying teachers and you do not have any teachers involved in the item writing process, you've got kind of a big flaw in your process. If you don't have people with extensive experience who understand a given subject area, if it's algebra, if it's architecture, whatever it happens to be, you need people who are kind of identified experts in that area and who have direct experience with the people who will be taking the test involved in this process. And not only do you need to have the right people involved, but you need to make sure that they're following the appropriate procedures here. And so it's very simple to kind of bring people in and just say, hey, we need you to write some items for a given test. But what should be happening is you should be going through a process and saying, okay, here's what we're going to be doing, and here's the training that's going to need to happen. Because when you bring people in and you start asking them to write test items, I'm pretty sure there's a good chunk of you who have done this before, it's not going to work. You need to go through a process of some training, and you need to get people comfortable with what they're doing, what your expectations are for the given test. And so you need to kind of have a fairly extensive training process that is involved to help people understand what's going on and how things were developed or what items are needed. Then you also need to look back and say, okay, what are we going to do to review the items? And so if you have a test writer come in the door, provide you some test items and give you that, and you just kind of accept them without any further review, again, you're going to end up running into issues because everybody, when they're writing items, is going to kind of bring in their own set of issues, their own set of concerns, and you're going to need an extensive review process to make sure that these items have gone through a rigorous process, flaws in the items have been identified, and the items are written in a way that's clear and understandable for your candidates. And so just the process of writing items themselves is going to be a critical component of any validation argument. Because if you can build a validation argument, you can say, look, we got these people involved, and we asked them to do this, we gave them this training, we went through these review steps. The validity argument that you're building is being supported by the rigor of the process that you followed to develop your test. And so as you're going through this process, you're not only building your test itself, you're also building your validation argument. Now, another critical component when we go back there is what process of field testing of the items happened, if any. Certainly, this is going to be an area that's going to vary an awful lot across credentialing environments and things like that. But the idea of building in a field test where items are being reviewed and actually taken by students, by people who are practicing in a given profession, and items are being pre-tested or field tested in this environment is going to be a critical component. And again, this allows you to provide data and information to support the validity of your test score, where you're going through and saying every item that is used on our test is tried out or field tested before it's used on an operational test. And so we can statistically evaluate whether or not the item performed as we expected. And you can statistically evaluate whether or not the item is as difficult as you expect, or what if the item is much more difficult than you anticipated. It can also be a critical step to allow you to look at things like fairness, where you can collect data and you can compare the performance of a given item or a given set of items by gender or by ethnicity, and you can collect that information that is going to be critical data for you to have in order to support the fairness of your assessment, to say that you've gone through this process. My colleague, Lisa O'Leary, I think it was back in August, gave one of these Ask a Psychometrician webinars, and she went through a very extensive process of describing some of these steps that we can go through when we're pre-testing, field testing an item. So I would encourage you, if this is an area where you're looking for some more information, to think about getting a hold of Lisa's presentation, and we can certainly provide that for you if it's something of interest. So again, all of that process of the development is going to be critical to your validation argument as you move forward. And again, I'm sure by now you're probably a little sick of seeing our wonderful wheel here, but I do want to talk a little bit about each of these steps and talk a little bit about what we would expect to see when we're talking about operationalizing or creating a test. When we're doing this, we're talking about, can you actually provide information to support the scoring of your test, for example, or how the test was built. And so different scoring models exist for different programs. And so having the evidence and having the information that you need to support, if you're using item response theory to score your test, do you have the data and information necessary to support that given use of the test? If you're providing quote-unquote diagnostic information where you're providing subscores on a given test, the process you're using to assemble the operational test can support that argument where you're saying, when we build our test, we're building it where we have 5 distinct areas and we're then providing score reports on those. And so I just wanted to mention this briefly as another area for you to think about collecting information and thinking about the data and information that you would need to have. Then in the vast majority of programs out there, there's a process of conducting a standard setting. Now, the standard setting does not necessarily have to happen right here, and I probably should have mentioned in general, there's an awful lot of kind of give and take across all of these different components of any testing program. But I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about standard setting just because it is such a critical component of any validation argument for any test score use. As soon as you start saying that this test score can be used to credential a given person or allow them to practice or allow them to skip a class, allow them to go into a given program, anytime you're making statements like that, they really highlight, and people are going to want to know information about what is done when you're going through and making those decisions. So if you say a score of 50 on my test means that a person can skip a class and go into a more advanced class, or a score of 75 indicates that this person is ready to practice in this profession. The scrutiny on how you reach that data and how you reach that decision of 75 is going to be absolutely critical. And so people are going to really focus an awful lot on what information is available as far as how that decision was made and what standard setting process was followed. So when people start talking about standard setting, in general, because there's such a focus on it, people have created a whole validity theories or validation theories around standard setting, and Michael Caine was, again, one of the critical people who did this. And they talked about three broad areas of evidence, but they talked about procedural evidence, internal evidence, and external evidence. And again, if you want to be able to support your validation argument and support the standard setting that was done for your given program, you're kind of under the gun to start being able to provide information across all three of these components to demonstrate that the standard setting process that you followed was okay. So when we start talking about procedural evidence, now there's an awful lot of overlap between these three areas and the three questions that I kept mentioning to you. And so you'll see an awful lot of overlap there. But when we talk about procedural evidence, we start talking about who it is who comes in to set your standard. And so if you bring in people who are familiar with the given area, if you're using it for college success and you're bringing in high school teachers and college professors together in a room, you've got a nice, well-rounded group of panelists that will support your validation argument. But if, on the other hand, sticking with education, you're looking at an assessment that's going to be used with sixth graders, and you have nothing but college professors in the room. The qualifications of the panelists, while they're certainly qualified, in a given content area, they're not qualified for this question. And so if you have people who are not working with people who are working in a given profession, or they have not worked in a given profession in a long time, the qualifications of your panelists become problematic. But then also when we talk about procedural evidence, we're talking about everything that happens throughout the standard setting process. And so people will look at what tasks were assigned to the panelists and what kind of directions were given to them. Were they comfortable with the process that they were going through? Frequently, when people are going through a standard setting process, there will be multiple surveys of the panelists throughout them, asking them if they were comfortable with what they were doing. Did they feel like the passing scores that were set were appropriate? Did they feel like they understood the task that was in front of them? And so all of that survey type of information is going to be critical data or critical information that you can provide to support the procedural validity of your standard setting. In addition to procedural validity, people talk about the internal validity of your standard setting process. And here, people are really looking at consistency here. And so when they're looking at this, they're trying to find different ways that they can do this. One way that people go through and look at consistency is within an overall panel, they'll look and see, are there people who are kind of wildly divergent within that panel, where you've got 3 people in a panel of 12 who really felt strongly that the passing scores that were set were too stringent or too lenient. And so if you see kind of those outliers and you consistently see people kind of jumping up and you don't see any consistency across the panel, it's a little bit of a flag for your internal validity argument. One of the other things that people do when they have the luxury of kind of multiple people or larger groups of people is they'll actually conduct 2 independent panels who will do the standard setting. And certainly this is, as I said, a little bit of a luxury when you have the time and when you have the resources to actually run 2 independent panels. You can run 2 independent panels and evaluate whether or not the recommended cut scores are consistent across the 2 independent panels. And so that can be a way that people can provide evidence to support the internal processes. But another way is looking at what happens throughout the process. And so Normally in most standard settings, there's a process where people provide an initial set of ratings, and then they'll provide another, they'll provide 2 or 3 or perhaps even 4 rounds of ratings. And you can provide information that says, as we went through multiple rounds of rating, as people spoke, we see people kind of coalescing around a given set of passing scores, and we see some more and more consistency across those. And the reason why this is going to be important is that we want to see people kind of reaching a bit of a consensus. It doesn't have to be perfectly in line, but we would like to see people kind of reaching a general consensus that, yeah, these are about right. We kind of understand what's happening here, and we think we can have some consistency across the overall panel. And so seeing some of that over multiple rounds, you see less and less variability, where you have less and less outliers, and you have less and less people kind of stepping outside of the box, if you will. The last thing to talk about is the idea of external evidence to support your standard setting process. And when we start talking about this, there's a lot of different ways this can be done. One of the ways that frequently people will look at this is if you've got something where you're looking at college readiness, and you can actually look at impact data where you can say, on our given assessment, if we're using this for college readiness, what percentage of students would be considered to be college ready, or what percentage of students who would be on track to be college ready. You can then gather other information, whether it be students from the same state, for example, or students from the same school district. And you can say, all right, using our assessment, we said 45% of our students are going to be classified as college ready. How consistent is that with other information? And so it could be information from a program like NAEP. It could be historical data in your given state. You just want to be able to evaluate how consistent your results are with other external variables. In a credentialing environment, you can look at it and say, okay, we're creating a new assessment, and this new assessment is saying only 25% of our candidates are ready and prepared to practice. Whereas historically speaking, using our prior version of the program, we've been saying 65%. What is the cause of that discrepancy? And so when you see things kind of being wildly different than kind of commonly accepted measures, the external evidence can become problematic. And so that's an area that you want to look for. Another area when we start thinking about external evidence that we try to encourage people to kind of build into their standard setting process is this idea of just like a reasonableness check. I think sometimes people will take a standard setting, go through the process, and just kind of stop at the end and just say, okay, this is it. But instead, what we want people to do is take a look at the results and evaluate them and say, okay, let's take a step back, look at people who are not necessarily involved in the day-to-day process, and look at whether or not what we have is reasonable, and whether we are providing kind of a reasonable cut score, and whether or not the results and the impact that we see is appropriate for our given program. And really only with that kind of opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, does this work? Does it fit with our overall goals? Can you kind of have evidence and have information to say you've really taken a step back and looked at the reasonableness of your program? And then just very briefly to mention the idea of maintenance of a test. When people talk about maintenance of a test, people usually have a tendency to think about, okay, do we need to create new items? When do we need to create new test forms? When do we need to kind of revisit the blueprints and things like that? But one of the other components that will be essential for the maintenance of your test is kind of the maintenance of your validity argument. And so always thinking about if you've got the relationship with external variables, for example, as you've gone through this process, can you collect information on a continuous basis where you are kind of continually evaluating the validity of your test? I worked for a number of years at the College Board where we worked on the SAT, and there was a continuous data collection from higher education institutions. Every year there was a dump of data, and every year we went through a process of looking at the relationship between the SAT and the performance in college. So there was this continuous evaluation of the kind of the essential validity arguments that you were building for a program like that. And so when you think about maintenance of a test, you don't want to think about, okay, what do we have to do to keep the test up and running, but you also have to think about how can we continually evaluate our validity argument, and how can we continually provide information to make sure that the data that we have is up to date and the data that we have is appropriate for a given test. And certainly an area that can kind of creep in to those conversations is as a test kind of goes through its life cycle, you end up seeing kind of drift of different test score usage. And so you'll see a program come out and you'll say, okay, this is what a given test score is for, but then all of a sudden people start saying, oh, can we use it for this? Or can we use it for that? And so you end up kind of getting into those conversations where people say, well, we know it was designed for admissions into college, but can we also use it to assign people to a given class? And so as those additional uses or additional questions about a test score arise, you're going to have the challenge of building a test validation argument for every single one of those additional claims. And so that's all part of the maintenance of your testing program and being able to kind of go through that process. So I think unfortunately, we're a little bit longer than I expected to be. At the end of the session there, I just wanted to provide you some quick references that I think would be useful for everyone if you're trying to get comfortable with building a validity argument and the key steps there. I just wanted to provide you some of the quick references there for your own use. And obviously, we are more than happy to talk to you about any of these issues regarding test score validation, whether it be some further clarification for any of the points I was trying to make here, or if it's just how this might be able to apply to a more specific scenario. We're more than happy to talk to you about it. And my email address is right here. Feel free to contact me or someone else at Alpine if we can be of assistance.
Thanks, Drew. And at this point, the little extra time that you took towards the end here must have answered most of everybody's questions, because at this point I don't have any questions that have come through. So I would open it up at this point to anybody out there that would like to ask a question of Drew. You're welcome to send that on in the Q&A panel. We'll wait just a couple of minutes here. Here's one that just came in that says, regarding evaluation criterion, please provide another example of an external variable in the credentialing field.
If I understand the question correctly, I think this is tied specifically to the standard setting component. And when we look at standard setting in credentialing, and we're looking at, I mentioned one of the variables that people will frequently use is the consistency of the passing score from historically to a new one. A couple other things that people can do is they can actually collect information on kind of known entities, if you will, where you can actually take a look and you say, okay, if these people took the test, how would they perform? And so sometimes you'll see people where they have information from physicians who are practicing. They'll actually ask them to take the test, and they'll actually go through the process and look at their performance. And so you can actually take known entities and see how they're performing. So that's one way that some people will do that. Another way that people will try to go through this process, because you know, asking people to actually sit down and take the test is certainly, again, kind of a resource-heavy requirement, so it could become a little problematic. But another thing that people will do is look at professions that are somewhat proximate. I think this is a somewhat reasonable thing to do when you look at some of the medical fields where there's a certain expectation for what people are doing in order to practice in areas that are similar. And so sometimes people will do that. Another thing that people will look at is what people are doing to get into the testing program itself. And so if you've got a scenario where people, pretty much anybody, can come in and take a given test, in general, that usually leads to people kind of looking at lower overall passing rates, where there's no education requirement, where if you are expected to go through a rigorous program, a graduate program, or anything like that, you may expect the people who are kind of walking in the door to be better qualified, and you wind up kind of supporting the idea of a higher pass rate. But on the other hand, if you're in a scenario where anybody can come in and take the test and there's really no filtering of them, that would be something that you would use to kind of support the idea of having a lower pass rate. So those are some of the things that I see people using when they're looking at this.
Great, thanks, Drew. Here's one that says, when you talk about drift, i.e. using items for other uses, you suggest that these items used differently should be validated for each particular use. And I guess, can you just expand upon that a little bit?
You know, I think what I should have said is I shouldn't have had that conversation about specific items. What I would say is that question about drift is really focused on kind of a test score or a sub-score. And so if you've got an overall test and you've said we're going to use it for college and career readiness, and that's it. But now you're going to say this test score can also be used to identify the need for remediation in a given area. The reason that can become problematic is the purpose kind of drives the type of items that you're going to have, or drives, say, the difficulty of your items. If you're trying to identify college, you have some more difficult items on there. But if you're trying to identify remediation, as an example, you may want to have simpler items. You may want to have items that allow you to gather a little bit more information about where students are not as well prepared. And so that's why that drift can be dangerous. And certainly in any testing program, you know, this can happen and people will start to use an item. And in some ways it's related to how, you know, the stakes of that given question. If you're saying like, oh, we can use this to assign a student to a given class, or we can use this to allow a student to skip a class, there's benefit to a student, so there's a certain stake there. And so if your drift or your test score usage drifts in a way where the stakes are fairly low, then maybe you don't have to worry about it so much, and you don't have to necessarily kind of say, let's build a whole validation around that. But if, on the other hand, people are using this to make high-stakes decisions and are making, you know, serious decisions that impact a student's or professional's life moving forward, then you're really going to be under the gun, and you're going to have to start thinking about trying to build up a validation argument to support that.
Okay, it looks like we have, I think, one more. What is the typical percentage of qualified candidates resulting from a credentialing exam?
You know, I really don't think there's kind of a typical number that I would feel comfortable pointing to, because I really do think that it varies an awful lot. You've got some programs where people are coming in after having 4 or 5 years of education, and they've gone through an extensive training process, and you end up having 90% of the people passing. But then you have others where, even with well-qualified candidates, the standard and the profession has determined that they need to have a very rigorous process, and you've got 30% of people passing. And so it really does range an awful lot. And so I don't think it's a great idea for me to say, oh, this is the typical amount. And I don't think it's appropriate for people to say, oh, let's go after what everyone else is doing. I think what's important is that for each program, that they take the time to evaluate who's coming in to take their given credential and determine whether or not, you know, how rigorous they need that standard to be, given the people who are coming in and given the work that they're going to be able to do.
Good. I think that wraps up the last question. So I will give everybody about 10 seconds here to post one more while I kind of wrap this up. But I wanted to Drew for jumping on and presenting today, and we had a number of people on the call today, and I wanted to thank each of you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Please let us know if you have webinar topics that you would like to cover in 2015, as we'll be figuring out that schedule here in the next couple of weeks. And then the slides and the webinar itself will be available on the Alpine website likely by Friday. So I will send out an email letting everybody know that it is available. We don't have any other questions, so I'm going to let everybody go. Thanks. Have a great afternoon and happy holidays to everybody, and we'll see you after the first of the year.
Thank you, everyone.